Howdy, welcome to this edition of the History of Christianity. Today we're on part 33. We're going to be talking about the Crusades, a time that has been studied in history and is definitely not a time when the church presented itself at its best, but also a time that's very influential in the history of the church. And this time centers on an offensive against Islam. Among the many ideals that captivated the imagination of Western Christians during the Middle Ages, none was as dramatic or as overwhelming as the crusading spirit. So this was a real spirit of the times. The Christian church was very much determined to get back into the eastern part of the world, get back into what was considered to be the Holy Land, and to reestablish a presence there that the church once had but had completely lost as a result of the rise of Islam in that area. The goals were to defeat the Muslims who threatened Constantinople, to save the Byzantine Empire, to reunite the western and eastern branches of the church, and to conquer the Holy Land. So some lofty goals, and they were going to be hard to achieve, but the question is, were they achieved? And they all were achieved, but only temporarily. The Muslims were defeated until they were united in a common purpose to expel the invaders. So these groups of Muslims were not united. So it was easier for the church as a united group to come in and kind of pick them off one by one. But eventually the Muslims figured out that it was in their self-interest to unite together against their common enemy. And so they did, and they were able to expel the invaders ultimately. Constantinople did survive until the 15th century, but it did finally fall to the Ottoman Turks. The two branches of the church reunited briefly, but ultimately split again with a greater hatred than before. So the reunification was not by choice, actually, as we'll see in a few minutes. It was forced, and it was not appreciated by the eastern side, and eventually led to even more animosity than there had been. And the Holy Land was in the hands of the Crusaders for about a century, so they did occupy it for a while, but ultimately after that time it was returned to Muslim control. And these crusades got off to a poor start. Pope Urban II at the Council of Clermont in AD 1095 set into motion what would become the First Crusade. We'll see through this time that the popes were the driving force behind getting these crusades going. And this was the first start. It's not considered the official First Crusade, but it was the first attempt. The goal was to save the Byzantine Empire from the Seljuk Turks and to retake the Holy Land. In many parts of Europe, crops had failed and disease ran rampant. This drew many, both of the lower classes and the nobility, to answer the call to go. So this is kind of a perfect storm. There was a real desire, there was a real passion among Christians in the western part of the world to go back into that eastern part and reclaim territory that they had once had, to help the church in the East as well. But then there were also factors that were going on back at home. Things were not all that great there. Crops were failing. Disease was running rampant. We already talked about last week, but this is a period of time in which there's not a lot of trade going on. Trade has been shut off. So the economy revolves around land. And if the land's not producing, then you're in real trouble. And so that also helped fuel the desire to go and to be a part of these crusades. And so a lot of people were very interested, and a lot of people did answer the call to go. A disorganized group under the very loose leadership of Peter the Hermit set out for Jerusalem. So again, this is the first start. They were able to get a group together. There wasn't not a lot of organization behind it. There wasn't a lot of planning ahead of time. They just kind of went out, and they did make their way for Jerusalem. Most of this initial wave lost their lives. A few survivors joined the ranks of the more organized crusades later on. So this first group failed completely. They were not ready for what they were going to face, but some of them did survive, and they became part of what would then be the official crusades which would follow. And we began, of course, with the First Crusade. The first formal crusade was led by Adhemar, Bishop of Puy. By various routes, the Crusaders converged at Constantinople. So these groups came from different places, and they kind of got the word out, let's all group together at Constantinople, and that'll be our place to stage this crusade. There they were well received by Emperor Alexius. They were also joined by Peter the Hermit and what was left of his army. So Peter kind of limped back out of his first attempt, but wasn't willing to give up. He got the guys that survived with him, and they're going to be part of this group that's going to begin what is known as the First Crusade. With the help of the Byzantines, they took Nicaea, which had been the capital of the Turks. So they were able to make a good first start. They got a battle won and retook Nicaea. They then took on the difficult journey across Asia Minor to Antioch. They've decided, okay, we got one victory under our belt. Let's go for something bigger. The Crusaders entered Antioch, but were soon besieged by a large Turkish army. So it's going to be their first real battle that they're going to have to contend with. Discouraged, some doubted the enterprise. But then someone said he had had a vision. And the vision was that the holy lance with which Christ's side had been pierced lay buried in Antioch. So somebody in this group went to bed and had a vision, or maybe they just saw it when they were awake, who knows. And they came and told everybody, hey, the spear that pierced Christ's side, we read about that in the Gospels, it is buried in Antioch. Wouldn't you know it? It's buried in Antioch. So you may be thinking, well, it's going to be a bad deal if they don't find that spear. Well, what happened was the seer told them where to dig, and they found a spear. So how that happened, I don't know. Maybe there was a real vision. Maybe that really was the spear. Maybe somebody planted it. Maybe they just got lucky. Who knows? But whatever happened, they found the spear, and that was all it took. This symbol led them to fight with frenzied zeal. I mean, they are ready to go and storm hell with a water pistol, and they're going to go win this battle because they've got the lance on their side. They can't lose. And it worked. The larger Turkish army broke and ran, leaving the Crusaders with much needed provisions. So the Crusaders were kind of out there. They didn't have enough provisions. That was part of the battle, was a battle of attrition. And if you were the more well-supplied army, especially if you're the bigger one too, you're probably going to win. Well, when they ran them off, that took care of that problem. They were able to have plenty of provisions then, and it was a big deal for them to win this battle. Well, Bishop Adhemar died of fever during the siege. Godfrey of Bouillon became the new leader. On June 7th, 1099, the army arrived at Jerusalem. So their big goal, obviously, in this effort to retake the Holy Land would be to get Jerusalem back. And they made their run. They had fought this battle. They had won a big victory at Antioch. They had their spear with them. They're going to go now under the direction of a new leader and try to retake Jerusalem. And so that launched a big battle for the Holy City. The Arabs defending Jerusalem were Fatimite Arabs from Egypt. So this was a different group than what they had been facing already, a different group that wasn't organized with the rest. The Crusaders found that the surrounding land had been razed, the wells poisoned, and the garrison in Jerusalem prepared for a long siege. So these Arabs were ready. They knew they were coming. They had kind of taken the precautions beforehand so that the people couldn't live off the land very well. The wells were poisoned, and they were ready. They were in their garrison. They were prepared for a long siege. So this is going to be a battle to take on. Resistance was strong, but finally a single knight was able to climb to the top of the city wall. So they got one guy up on the wall, and he was able to hold a space there, and he found a breach. And with that breach, the battle turned, because that knight was able to then get the others up on the wall and to hold that space where they were, and then to begin to enter into the city. So as the breach grew, the Crusaders were able to sweep into the city on July 15th, 1099. All the defenders of the city were killed, as well as many civilians. Now, you think about this group. Should Christians be launching a military campaign? You don't find anything in the scripture that is calling on Christians to battle a physical war. In fact, the Word of God says that our battle is not against flesh and blood. It's against the spirits and the powers behind flesh and blood. And so already this group shouldn't be out there. Biblically, they shouldn't be out there. So they're not going to be in having the best intentions as it is. But then their actions in this battle reveals even more that there's a real serious problem with this. When they got into that city, they began raping the women. They took infants and threw them against the walls to kill them. A lot of the Jews that were in the city, innocent Jews that were just living there under the rule of the Muslims, they retreated into the synagogue, and these crusaders surrounded and burned them alive in the synagogue. So when I say these crusades were not the church's finest moments, this is what we're talking about. This is despicable. It is a black mark in the history of the church. And it's just absolutely horrendous and absolutely inconceivable for us to be able to understand how people that were called or said they were called to follow Jesus Christ could do things like this. And yet they did. We know it's a different time than times we live in, but still inexcusable. And this is going to result in a lot of animosity between the Western world and the Eastern world for a long time to come. And you can see why it was well earned with this kind of nonsense going on. Well, the Crusaders were able to take the city, and then they began the process of organizing the conquered lands after the fashion of Western Europe. So they started dividing land up and started to rule it like it was being ruled in Western Europe with a feudal system. And so this is where the Holy Land was at this point after the First Crusade. Well, there were going to be more crusades to come. Following these victories, many of the Crusaders returned home. They had done their duty. They had accomplished the goals that they had set out to do. They had raped their women and killed their children and all the other ridiculous things that they were going to do. So it's time to head back home. Godfrey of Bouillon was scarcely able to retain enough knights to defend Jerusalem. He didn't have a whole lot there. Obviously, the Arabs are going to want to get this territory back. So it's not just you go in and occupy and you're done. He needed defense. So he didn't have a lot. There needed to be reinforcements sent. And at Ashkelon, the Crusaders defeated the Muslims, and they were able to keep Jerusalem for a brief span after that. So they won a big battle there. But they were still going to need help. So small bands of armed men would arrive from Europe. They would stay for a time of service. Many of them remained, but others simply returned home. So there was kind of a revolving door of people coming in and out. Some would stay and be part of the occupying force there in the Holy Land, but many of them just wanted to come for a while and then go back home. Repeatedly, groups of followers were gathered to march towards Jerusalem. So there's kind of an influx of these guys coming and going all the time. And this even included groups of children. Amazingly, if you go back and study, we don't have a lot of time to talk about this today, but if you go back and study, this is an amazing time period. People in Western Europe sent their children in groups of nothing but children to go and be a part of the Crusades, and they're called the Children's Crusades. And it wasn't just one of these. There were several of them. And during these Children's Crusades, there would be masses of children and adolescents who would march eastward. They just sent them on their way. And what would you expect would happen with these children? Are they going to go into the Holy Land and win a huge battle and be victorious? Well, no, probably not. And in fact, that's not what happened. They often died along the way. Or they would wander into territory of people, and they would see groups of kids coming through that were really not able to defend themselves. And they thought, oh, this is a great source of slaves. So they enslaved the kids. And so most of these children didn't arrive in the Holy Land for sure, and they never went back home either. They either died or they were taken as slaves. This leads us to the Second Crusade. The fall of Edessa in AD 1144 gave rise to a call for a Second Crusade. So this is a city that fell, and because it did, that got everybody riled up to go back in and be a part of a Second Crusade. And this one's now going to be under the leadership of Louis VII of France and Conrad III of Germany. And they took an army of almost 200,000 and headed out for the Holy Land. So you're probably thinking, wow, that's a lot. So they probably did really well. Well, they didn't do well. The army was repeatedly defeated by the Turks, and they accomplished almost nothing, very little. Yet for a while, the kingdom of Jerusalem grew strong. Under Elmerek I, it even extended to Cairo. So this kingdom of Jerusalem went all the way down into Egypt. They had taken a lot of territory and doing well, but eventually the Muslims regrouped and retook Jerusalem in AD 1187. So you can imagine that that wasn't something that the Western Europeans were all excited about. They had lost now their big prize, Jerusalem. So it's going to be time for a third crusade. So Pope Gregory VIII called for a renewal of the Crusades. Let's go back and get our territory back. The Third Crusade was led by Emperor Frederick Barbarossa, Richard the Lionhearted of England, and Philip II Augustus of France. So these were three major rulers. Definitely probably heard of Richard the Lionhearted, if none of the rest of them. And they're going to be the ones to lead this Third Crusade. This is an important one because this is the one to go back and get Jerusalem. And again, three really strong leaders, probably going to lead to some great victories. Well, no, this crusade failed as well. Frederick drowned, and his army kind of just dissolved after that, so they lost him. Richard and Philip were only able to take Acre after a siege that lasted 2 years. So it took them 2 years to get this little place, this small territory. and they were able to take it, but it was 2 years worth of fighting to do it. So about that time, Philip returned to Europe, hoping to take some of Richard's lands. He's thinking, all right, Richard's stuck over in the Holy Land. He's still over there being occupied with what we're doing there. So this would be a great opportunity for me to sneak on back home and go and try to get some of Richard's lands while I'm at it. So that's what he did. He headed back. Well, Richard was captured by the Emperor of Germany as he was trying to get home, and he was kept prisoner until a great ransom was paid. So nothing really great came out of this Third Crusade. They did win one battle, took one place, but nothing of significance, and it ended up one of them was dead, one snuck back home to try to take the other one's land, and one ended up being imprisoned and a big ransom having to be paid. So not a really great result for the Third Crusade. Well, the Third Crusade wasn't the last one. There's more to come, and that, of course, would lead us to the Fourth Crusade. The Fourth Crusade, called by Pope Innocent III, was an even greater disaster, if you can believe that. These crusades just get worse as time goes on. The first one, they had some success, and just about after that, there wasn't a whole lot more. Originally called on to attack Salahuddin in Egypt, it was rerouted to Constantinople. So they were going to go to Egypt and set up an attack there, but then all of a sudden, oh, wait, we need you in Constantinople. Worse, because Constantinople is in trouble. So the Crusaders were able to go in and take Constantinople, and these Western Crusaders founded the Latin Empire of Constantinople that lasted from 1204 to 1261. So they didn't last a long time, but they went in. And this is the time that you could say that the Eastern and Western Church reunified, but it wasn't a really good reunification. It wasn't both sides coming back together and saying, hey, let's get back together. It was one side came in and kind of conquered the other side. And yeah, they were reunited, but you can imagine the people of Constantinople were not excited about it, and they weren't. The Byzantines did not accept this new rule. They were not having it, and they resisted during this entire time. We want to get our territory back. We want you out of here. And in 1261, the Byzantines retook Constantinople, and that ended the Latin Empire. So this episode grew the enmity of the Greek East toward the Latin West. So a forced reunification actually leads to more strife. So once again, these crusades are not accomplishing anything good. It's only accomplishing bad stuff. And it's not a surprise that it is, because this is something the Christian church should not be involved in. It's a dark mark on the history of Christianity, maybe the darkest time in it. And nothing good's coming out of it so far. Well, there's a series of final crusades that we can talk about as in one big bunch here. The Fifth Crusade attacked Egypt and accomplished little. They didn't really accomplish anything good there. So the fourth one was supposed to go to Egypt. It didn't. This one did go to Egypt. They didn't do anything worthwhile. The Sixth Crusade, led by excommunicated Emperor Frederick II, had better success. So this one actually did have a little success. The emperor and the sultan at the time struck an agreement, and this agreement gave Frederick Jerusalem, Nazareth, and Bethlehem. So the Western world is able to get back into that core part of the Holy Land, the part that they really were concerned with. The Seventh and Eighth Crusades, led by Louis IX of France, were major disasters. So the sixth one was okay, got a little bit done there, but the seventh and eighth, just really bad again. The king was captured by the Muslims in the Seventh Crusade and requiring a large ransom to free him, so he got out of that one. But then he didn't have the good sense to say, you know what, I was captured, it cost a lot of money to get me out of this, let me just cut my losses. No, he went back for more, and during the Eighth Crusade, he died of fever in Tunis. So not a great result for Louis IX. Things didn't go very well for him, and the Seventh and Eighth Crusades were a big bust. And that leads us to the year AD 1270, and that leads us to the end of the Crusades. They finally decided, you know what? This is not working. We're not accomplishing anything. We're losing our people. We're losing our rulers. We're getting land that we can't keep, and it's time to put a stop to it. So they did. That was the end of the Crusades as far as going to the Holy Land. What we're going to find out, though, is it didn't really end the Crusades necessarily completely, because this idea of the crusade stuck around and it began to be applied for things back home. Now, there's one more chapter we need to look at before we kind of look at conclusions about this period of time. And this was kind of the Spanish Crusade, and it's called the Spanish Reconquista. Spain had been conquered, if you'll remember, by the Muslims in the 8th century, And there was only a small portion free of Muslim rule in northern Spain. There was a little area in northern Spain that didn't have any Muslims, but the rest of Spain was occupied by the Muslims. It was the only part in Western Europe that retained Muslim rule. And so there was a need for a crusade to that area to liberate the Spanish territory from the Muslims. Later on, the Franks established a presence in Spain further east. So there was a little group of Franks that were in the east. There was a little group of Spaniards that were in the north. But by and large, this territory belonged to the Muslims. But these two groups, the Spaniards in the north and the Franks in the east, combined forces, and they went after their common enemy, Islam. And that struggle became known as the Reconquista, the reconquering of Spain. The discovery of the tomb of St. James played an important role. By the 9th century, Christians began to come from all over Western Europe on pilgrimages to the tomb. So if you'll remember, way back in the first episode we did of this series, we talked about what happened to key figures from the New Testament later on after the New Testament was written. And one of the traditions was that James went to Spain, and there was maintained a big tradition of James being there. Now, historically, do we know that James was there with certainty? No, we don't. Could he have been there? He could have, but the discovery is in quotation marks because, as of most things during this time, these things that were found from the biblical times are very suspect. It's very unlikely they actually found the tomb of James. But it didn't matter because there was enough of a tradition of James being in Spain that they were able to say, hey, you know what? You'll never believe it. We found James' tomb. You need to come check this out. And so Christians began. They were part of pilgrimages from all over Western Europe, and they began to come into this area of northern Spain to check out the tomb of St. James. And this was a big deal because it brought northern Spain into constant contact with the rest of Western Christendom. And it got the rest of the Western Christians thinking, you know what? We need to liberate the rest of Spain. This is St. James territory, and we like these Christians that are in the north. Let's help them out. Let's help them get rid of the Muslims. And a big key to that was people coming in, and because of this St. James tomb, to get to associate with the people of northern Spain. Eventually, St. James became the patron saint of the struggle against the Muslims, so he kind of became a symbol of their fight, and he became known as Santiago Matamoros. In English, that means St. James the Moor Slayer. So he was the guy that they were rallying behind to go kill these Muslims and get them out. Good old St. James that may very well have never stepped foot in Spain, but didn't matter for them. He was the symbol of this struggle. So there were several battles that led to the Spanish Reconquista gaining more territory in Spain. In 1212, the Christian kings joined forces to defeat the Moors at the Battle of Naves de Tolosa. And that was a big deal because they were able to finally win this battle and get the Muslims out of there. By 1248, only one Moorish state remained, the Kingdom of Granada. Granada finally fell in 1492. At this time, this Kingdom of Granada kind of had a deal with the rest of Spain. They could have got them out, but they actually let them stay because they were paying tribute to the kings and they were a good source of income. But eventually they did decide these guys have got to go, and they got them out in 1492. But that was the only one. So this was probably the only successful part of the Crusades, and it happened in Western Europe actually. But the crusade to get the Muslim permanently out of Spain was successful. They were able to do it. And it led to the Muslims getting out of Western Europe altogether, and it led to Spanish rule in Spain. Well, it's important then to look at what are the consequences of the Crusades. What kind of things happened as a result of this time? And as you probably gathered from what we've talked about, it was mostly stuff that wasn't all that great. The most obvious consequence of the Crusades was the increased mistrust and enmity between Christians and Muslims, as well as between Latin and Byzantine Christians. And this still lingers to this very day. There's a great mistrust between the West and the East. There's a lot of misunderstanding between the West and the East. There's animosity that's been built up for years, and there's other reasons for it besides just this, but definitely this plays a part in it. between the Eastern world and the Western world, and between these religions, Christianity. You can also throw Judaism in there, and then the Muslims. And it didn't end back then. It hasn't ended now. And there still remains a rift between the Western Christians and the Eastern Christians even till this day. So the Crusades did nothing to help this, and in fact made it a whole lot worse. The Crusades enhanced the power of the papacy due to the fact that the popes called for the Crusades and appointed their leaders. So papal authority got even stronger during this time. Of course, depending on your point of view, you can argue that as a good thing or a bad thing. I think church history during this period of time and ongoing probably points out that it wasn't necessarily the best thing for the church. Again, you may disagree with that. That's fine. But regardless, that's what happened. The popes gained a lot more power internationally because they were the ones who were calling for these crusades. And the fact that they were able to actually make them happen, that they could get whole armies of people to leave their homeland and go a long ways away from home and fight these wars, that was a big power play. And it very much enhanced the power of the papacy. Contact with the Holy Land returned Christians' attention toward the historical narratives of the Bible. So you can make an argument this is not a bad thing. This might actually be a good part of this. Just the fact that their minds were turned toward the Holy Land. They became a lot more interested in the historical part of the scripture, learning about the places that the Bible talks about, and therefore spending more time in the Bible. There was also a type of devotion that came to center on the humanity of Jesus. There was a lot of interest in the humanity of Jesus because you're going over to places where Jesus walked. You're going and you're interested in Jerusalem, retaking that. You're interested in Bethlehem. You're interested in Nazareth. You can come back home and say, you know what? I was at the tomb where Jesus was buried. You go to Jerusalem today, you can find the tomb where Jesus was buried. Is that really the tomb where Jesus was buried? Well, no, we don't know that. How in the world would we know that? Nobody knows where he was buried. Not for sure. Could it have been? Yeah, but you don't know it. There's a lot of things like that. The church that's built over the spot where the manger was, just things like that. Here's, you can go over there on a tour. Here's the very spot in the river where John the Baptist baptized Jesus. None of that stuff do you know, but you can go back home and talk about it. I saw where Jesus walked. And so a lot of interest came on at this time period on the actual humanity of Jesus, his life and his struggle, his passion, and his ultimate death and resurrection. So again, that's not a bad thing in and of itself. The fact that it took having to have these horrible crusades to get people's interest in it, I guess, is not so great. But it did at least have some positive effect on people back home. But with all of these things, there's also a negative part of that as well. So there's a renewed interest in relics. And Europe became flooded with pieces of the true cross, bones of patriarchs, and teeth of biblical figures. Can you imagine? People started coming home from the Holy Land. You found a hunk of wood. Guess what? This is a piece of the cross. You can come and you can buy a piece of the cross. I'll sell you a piece. You can come and you can pay to touch this and it'll heal your wounds. It'll give you good luck, fortune, whatever. Oh, look, I found a bone of Isaiah. I found, whoever. I found Peter's teeth. I mean, whatever. You can throw anybody you want to in there. And again, when we say Europe became flooded, understand there are enough pieces of this cross that it could have built thousands of crosses. I mean, there are a whole tree's worth of pieces of the cross. There are enough bones of patriarchs for just tons of people, way more than what they were saying. Unless all of these people had about 10 of the same bones all through their bodies. There's teeth of biblical fear, enough teeth to fit the mouths of every person in the Bible and then more. So ridiculous claims, but people are very interested. If you think that you might get a shot at touching the cross of Jesus, would you go do it? I would have. If I really believed that, I would absolutely want to do that. Now, we know in our day and time, it's not even possible, really, that you could find a piece of the cross and bring it back. Nobody would really be able to rely on that if you were thinking clearly. The bones of these people, would I be interested in holding, Malachi's tooth? That one I'm not so sure I'm that interested in. I don't know that I want to touch his tooth. I wouldn't believe that it was his tooth. But if you could convince me that here's some bones from Isaiah or Jeremiah or whoever, I might want to come see it. I don't know. But at this time, the people were very interested in this. They were very superstitious. So even just being in the presence of these objects in their minds was it was a significant thing. And so if you're over there in the Holy Land, you find a hunk of wood or you find some teeth or you happen to unearth some bones, why not go back and say it's David's or whoever you want to say? Why not go do that? Because you'll get a lot of people interested and you probably make some money off of it. And they did. And so this is the bad side of that curiosity about the biblical things, was that could then be exploited by people, and it was. Well, another thing that happened was the monastic ideal found a new direction in military orders. So these traditional vows that were taken in the monasteries of obedience, poverty, and chastity were then applied to groups of warriors. So there became groups that were organized like monastic groups, but they weren't really concerned with doing the things that the monastic groups did. They were concerned in going off and being warriors. And that's where we get groups like the Order of St. John of Jerusalem, the Templars, probably heard of them, and others like them were founded in the Holy Land. So these group of warriors that went over to the Holy Land to fight these battles organized under the monastic ideals and became these sort of hybrid groups that some people are very superstitious about even now and very interested in. But that's the origin of these groups. Well, there are even more consequences of the Crusades as well. The crusading spirit was also used to combat heresy. So this is what I was talking about earlier when I said the Crusades went away as far as going into the Holy Land, but the crusading spirit didn't go away. So what the popes figured out was they could get people riled up under a cause, and they could fight these battles back home as well. It worked out in Spain in a good way, getting Spanish rule back in their own territory, but it wasn't necessarily used all the time in an honest way or a good way. One way was to combat heresy. Again, it's not a bad thing, but as you'll see in a moment, these Christians at this time just had some real problems. So in southern France and some parts of Italy, there was some heretical doctrine that was established that was very similar to Manichaean dualism, and that doctrine was beginning to spread in the area. They believed, the Manichaean dualism believed, that there was a cosmic struggle between equally powerful forces of good and evil. We talked about this earlier on in this study as well. You can go back and listen. I forget exactly which episode it's on. But this group kind of, again, these heresies just keep coming back. These same problems keep coming back. And here it pops its head up again, one of these groups. Pope Innocent III decided we don't need this heresy. And yeah, absolutely, we agree on that. So he called a crusade against these groups. So he used the idea of these crusaders going in as warriors to fight a battle for orthodoxy. So in 1209, noblemen from northern France invaded southern France. Atrocities similar to those which took place in the Muslim lands were committed. So these groups come in, and again, supposedly fighting for a Christian thing, supposedly fighting for good, supposedly going in with the purest intentions in heart. They go in and rape women, throw infants against the wall and bust their heads open, burn people alive. And I mean, they do it all. They do all the same stuff. It's just ridiculous. There's a major problem here. Yes, we don't need heresy. Do we need this kind of stuff going on? No. And that's not happening even against foreign groups now. It's against your own brothers and sisters here back home. And Pope Innocent III didn't care. He got what he wanted out of it. The heresy ended, as you can imagine, with that going on. And he was able to then figure out, and people for years after this figured out, hey, we can get people riled up and we can get them to go out and fight battles for the church. So we don't have to win theological debates. We don't have to debate about this. We don't have to even prove theologically that we're right. We'll just get an army together and we'll kill you if you're going to go against us. When that has to do with legitimate heresy, it's bad, but at least it's for a good cause, I guess you could say. It's a horrible way to do it, and it's absolutely inexcusable, but at least the cause is pure. Well, there's going to be some times that people will go against the church, and the people going against the church are actually right, and they'll still use these methods against them because they figured out they could. So again, a very black mark on in the history of Christianity. And that crusading ideal was used in very different ways than the original intent of retaking the Holy Land. Theology was also affected by renewed contact with the Muslim world. And the reason for this was there was a revival of the philosophy of antiquity. So some of the Muslims had kept alive these ancient philosophies of the past. One in particular was Aristotle. They had this knowledge that was preserved. And as contact with the Muslim world continued, and as this Muslim world was in Spain and contact between the Christians and them got more prominent during this time, that sort of teaching got back out there. And in the 13th century, a great deal of philosophical and theological activity would occur as a result. So we possibly will get back into that later on, but that was also one of the outcomes of this, something that was contributed to the Western world back from the Eastern world that had kind of been forgotten, kind of not really been part of their thought, gets reestablished now because of this renewed contact. Also, there's a big change in the economy at this time. The Crusades helped usher in the return of trade to the economy of Western Europe. So understand this, if you go back and read historians, not all of them are going to agree that the Crusades helped on the same level. There's a lot of factors that come into play for this. So this is not just purely the church and the Crusades leading to big changes in Western Europe, but at least they were a part of it. So they didn't do it all, and the changes may have happened anyway, but at least you can say these Crusades and the church itself had a part to play in this. And one of the big things was that the economy changed again because trade came back in. So when the trade was cut off between the West and the East, the economy changed from a monetary economy to one that had to do with holdings of land, and that brought rise to the feudal system. Well, now that we have an economy back trading again, we don't have just bartering among local people. We don't have just land for you to live on for a feudal lord to give you part of or let you work or whatever. We now have money coming back into play. We now have a group of people that can come in as merchants and gain more power because they are then now part of this economy that has come back because of trade. So because of that, there was a shift in power away from the nobility, and it helped to give rise to the growth of cities. So with this growth of cities, a new class emerged, which I'm certain have heard of before, the bourgeois. And the bourgeois literally means those who dwell in cities. So this urbanization of the world, leaving the rural world behind, these little tracts of land that people worked, and now gathering in big cities and having trade and having this new class of people rise up, it made a big change in the world and eventually lead to the French Revolution. So big changes going on. The whole culture is changing. And is the church completely responsible for it? No. Are the Crusades completely responsible for it? No. There's a lot of factors, but it is true that these things, at least in whatever way you want to argue, whether it's a small way or a large way, these Crusades and the activity of the church during this time at least had a part to play in the changes that are going on throughout Western Europe. So those are some of the consequences of the Crusades. Again, you look back at this time, and I don't think there's anybody in modern day that could look at this and say it was a good thing. Throughout the history of the church, it was looked at in different ways. Some of the successes were looked at as being a very good thing. You even had people that were looking at things like, finding a spear. This is proof that God is with us. Those kind of things were considered for a long time. But we know now, and should have been known then, there's something is really wrong. There's a big problem in the church. That spirit that was there before Constantine came in and brought the church in the mainstream, that spirit of the lower classes, loving people and caring for people and preaching the sacrifice that comes with becoming a Christian and following the Lord, the desire for peace, the desire for turning away from evil, the desire for turning away from violence. That is totally flipped. And now you've got the rise of Christians actually going out and physically making war. And this is not the first time. We've talked about this. There's been several of these groups. But becoming invading armies, going into other territory, whether you think that belongs to you or not, is not anything Christians should be a part of. And yet it happened during this time. And it just shows that there's some real problems in the church and the real problems with Christianity. And we're all building up, as you know, to that Reformation era. The Protestant Reformation is coming, and the seeds are being planted all along the path. It doesn't happen overnight. There's not just one thing that brings it about. But I hope that you're seeing through each step we take every week how we're getting further and further away from what really was the orthodoxy of the church, and further away from people being treated the way that they should be, and more towards a power-hungry group of rulers in the church that were totally taking advantage of people and leading the church in a very, very dark way. And this is a big part of that. So next week, we're going to be talking about the golden age of medieval Christianity. So we're going to look at Christianity during this medieval time, the pinnacle of it. And then following that, we'll kind of see the downslope of it as it goes down through the medieval times and leads us right on into the Protestant Reformation. Just a word about where we're at in the study. We're finishing out this period of time from the end of the New Testament to the dawn of the Protestant Reformation. And in the book that I'm using as a guideline, it's not the only thing I'm using for a source, but it's the biggest one, honestly. In looking at the book, there's about 6 chapters left, including the one next week. I would say, just skimming through, I don't think any of those chapters will be needed to be divided into 2. I don't intend to. Of course, I said that before and then got to one and needed to. So my hope is that at most, we've got 6 more weeks of this study. It may even be that some of those chapters can be combined. I doubt it, just because I know when I get into these, it usually ends up taking at least one. But you never know. There's always a possibility of that. So maybe one gets taken to 2, but then one gets combined and we still end up with 6. I'm really hoping that we're not going to go over 6 more. That's my intention. I don't know that for sure yet, but just kind of give you a feel for where we're at. We're probably looking at about 5, 6, 7 more weeks of this. And then it'll be time to make a decision about whether or not to continue on. I've already had some of you who have asked, please continue, go into the Protestant Reformation time. We're very interested in that period of time. I do understand that. It's probably really, really relevant for those of us that are part of the Protestant church, but even if you're not, just to know and understand that period of history. It's also a very interesting period. But I haven't committed to that yet, but I am strongly considering it. So I'll let you know as we go through this, but just so you kind of have an idea, we're probably looking at about 6 more of these, and then we'll move on to something else or just end it. So thanks again for being with me today. Hope that you have a very blessed week. Hope that this information was something that you could enjoy and learn from, and pray that God will bless you in your path this week. Hope to talk to you again next week. God bless.